Hello and welcome to a Firstpost POV. Tensions are rising rapidly in the Caribbean. The United States has deployed the largest warship in the world, an aircraft carrier called the USS Gerald Ford, to this region. This is part of a series of deployments that have been made by US President Donald Trump amid escalating tensions with Venezuela. Now, the United States and Trump says that Venezuela is smuggling drugs into the United States, a charge that has been rejected by Venezuela. Nonetheless, Trump and his military has carried out at least 19 strikes on so-called drug boats in the region. Some experts have called these extrajudicial killings. The question is, with these new deployments, are we going to see a more escalation and perhaps a full-scale war or an invasion of Venezuela by the US military? Let me put some of these questions to my guest, Mr. Guillaume Long, who is the former foreign minister of Ecuador. Thank you so much, Mr. Long, for speaking to us on Firstpost.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Now, towards the end of last month in October, you wrote for the Al Jazeera and you said that one of the possible scenarios from what's happening right now is that the rhetoric will keep escalating, but we won't actually see any strikes on Venezuelan targets or targets on mainland Venezuela. From what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, especially yesterday with the deployment of the largest warship on the earth, do you think that it's time to change that calculation? Do you think strikes on mainland Venezuela are indeed possible?
Yes, I certainly do. And I did make that point that I thought that they were possible. However, I thought that they were undesirable and there would be a strategic mistake from the purpose of the United States and, of course, disastrous for Venezuela and for the entire region. But certainly, I think it is possible. I think there are tensions within the Trump administration about this. On the one hand, I think Secretary of State Marco Rubio and his colleagues or his allies even in the cabinet, who tend to be described as part of the neoconservative lobby, and of course Marco Rubio himself being of Latin American origin, of Cuban origin, is very passionate about regime change in Venezuela and in Cuba, are probably working hard in favor of airstrikes or in favor of a military intervention in Venezuela and possibly elsewhere, whereas I think other actors in the Trump administration are probably less favorable to this, possibly even President Trump himself. We don't really know, but we know his MAGA base is increasingly hostile to a military intervention in Venezuela. But it's certainly possible. I think it would be disastrous. This would be the first time in history that the US attacks a South American state. And here the differentiation is important. The US has occupied, invaded Central American and Caribbean countries, who tend to be smaller, on several occasions throughout its history, but never a South American state. Venezuela, despite a migratory crisis, which has meant 7 million people have left Venezuela, still has 28 million inhabitants, which is larger than what Iraq had in 2003. The last time the United States invaded a Latin American state and occupied it for a significant amount of time, that was Panama in 1989, 1990, and it only had 2.5 million inhabitants. So this is a country that has 10 times more inhabitants, and I think it would mean a significant challenge, military and political challenge for the United States if they were to do this.
Right. Now, when we talk about the military strikes happening, there's obviously got to be a long-term goal with that. It won't take a long time for the US military to neutralize the Venezuelan military. That much the power asymmetry is pretty clear. But there is a question of what do you do after that? Because will President Nicolas Maduro just say, okay, I'm done, I'm leaving? If so, who takes his place as the president or the leader of Venezuela? Do you see the US administration creating a long-term plan after a possible military strike? Or do you think this is all just, let's see where it goes, we'll plan on the fly?
I think that's a great question. I think the US strategy has been all about convincing members, officers inside the Venezuelan military to defect, to rebel, to even organize coups. There have been a number of failed coups that have been supported by the United States since actually the first one in 2002 against Hugo Chavez himself, and now more aggressively against Nicolas Maduro since 2019. There were several failed attempts in 2019, including with the recognition on behalf of the United States of a parallel government, the government of Juan Guaido, which kind of ended in fiasco in 2023. There was a mercenary invasion in 2020 in Venezuela that was most probably supported by the United States. So So far they failed to produce this regime change by encouraging members of the Venezuelan military to rebel. So this is a question as to what extent is the Venezuelan military loyal to the government of Nicolas Maduro, and to what extent, to go back to your question, airstrikes would actually mean this time there is a significant amount of people inside the Venezuelan military who are going to defect. I am myself very skeptical of this. I think every time you have a failed coup, the security apparatus, is strengthened in a way, or purged, if you like. The would-be traitors are identified, and there is less likelihood that there will be a successful coup next time round. And there have been so many of these that I think it's a pretty tight ship right now, the Venezuelan military. And I am skeptical that even airstrikes would lead to the kind of outcomes that some of the United States, some of the US members of the administration are hoping they will achieve. They failed to obtain this outcome in Iran. I think they would fail to obtain it in Venezuela. It's also, I think, beyond the military, a miscalculation about whether you would have a sort of spontaneous uprising inside Venezuela. You do have also, aside from the military, Chavista militias. The population in Venezuela is very politicized. It's true that it's polarized along sort of Chavista and anti-Chavista lines, but there is still a very staunch Chavista base. And that base is very unlikely to accept violent regime change, especially if it's imposed by the United States, and would likely mount an insurrection if there was a successful regime change. So I think the different kinds of scenarios are not favorable to a swift, quick, clean regime change that the United States would be hoping for. And we're much more likely looking at a Libya kind of scenario, but not necessarily at a Libya kind of outcome. So disastrous and potentially terrible in humanitarian terms, but not necessarily successful in political terms.
Right. Let's also look at what the other side will be thinking. I mean, I'm just thinking what Nicolas Maduro is seeing right now. He's got 100,000 tons of American firepower heading towards his shores. He's surrounded by almost 15,000 soldiers in military sites. Last month, we had an interesting report which claimed that Maduro tried to offer something to the US president. He basically said, I'll give all my resources, all my oil and gold contracts to American companies. I'll cut off all deals I have with Russia and China, which are American rivals, and in exchange, you let me continue in power. Now, this wasn't officially confirmed by either side, but do you think there's some truth to that President Maduro will be willing to go as far as to say that I'm effectively selling my country to you, but just let me stay on in power? Do you think that's a possibility?
I mean, that report was never really confirmed. It's difficult for me to say what has been offered. There were certainly diplomatic exchanges between the United States and Venezuela. There was, in fact, someone who had been named by the Trump administration to lead on those exchanges, Grenell. He has now been deauthorized by the Trump administration, which is one of the elements which led to much speculation as to whether, the fact that there were no more diplomatic exchange would now lead to open warfare. So we don't really know. I mean, I doubt whether Nicolas Maduro would have offered everything, all the resources of Venezuela to the United States in order to appease them. I think there's a lot of lack of understanding inside the United States and inside the US policy apparatus, unfortunately, of Venezuelan politics. And in not only the Chavista camp, not only the Maduro camp, but also the opposition. There are large chunks, large constituencies, if you like, of the Venezuelan opposition, including of the Venezuelan kind of largely pro-American right-wing opposition, who are against these strikes and against the military intervention because they think they would probably not be successful and cause extreme hardship for Venezuela. And unfortunately, the United States, I think, is been repeatedly kind of listening to or siding with some of the most radical elements inside the Venezuelan oppositions. The Venezuelan politicians who are calling for the bombing of their own country, right, which are not necessarily a majority even inside the opposition to Maduro. So I think a lot of what we're seeing is actually a lack of knowledge, quite a lot of ignorance in terms of what Venezuelan politics are all about. And therefore, I think I would extend that to US understanding of Maduro's motivations. These people have been through a lot of hardship already. They've faced sanctions. They've faced international isolation. I'm not sure that upping the stakes or doubling down and being more aggressive is going to make them meeker, or make them sort of raise their arms in the air and surrender. I don't think that's necessarily what those kinds of pressure will cause in Venezuela. I think maybe even the reverse. You might see a more emboldened anti-imperialist or nationalist response, both at the government level and maybe even at the level of the population.
Right. Let's also pull back and look at the larger messaging from America. Now, US interest in this part of the world, in the Western Hemisphere, it's not new. It was instituted as the Monroe Doctrine for a long time, and we've seen repeated invasions and incursions and interventions by the American in that part of the world. But then there was a pivot to Asia, there was a pivot to Europe, to the Middle East, and now we're seeing Donald Trump come back and saying that the Western Hemisphere is once again very key to American national security. Should we see this as a long-term pivot again by the United States, where they are going to continually invest more resources and more time in that part of the world, or is just limited to Venezuela as one country?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I mean, the United States started as a regional power, and then before it became a global power, and Latin America played a huge role in the rise of the United States as a global power after the Spanish-American War of 1898, the period of gunboat diplomacy, where the United States really reimposed the Monroe Doctrine, or reinterpreted the Monroe Doctrine, and bullied a lot of countries to sort of align in something which sort of mimicked European colonialism back in the early 20th century, in its what it saw as its backyard, right, which has now been rechristened by Joe Biden himself as the front yard, which is not something which the Latin Americans have taken very kindly. And of course, we're now seeing the Trump administration talking of, the Monroe Doctrine and so on and so forth. And I think you're right. I mean, the premise of your question is, even Secretary of State Marco Rubio has recognized that we live in a more multipolar world. And so what does that mean for the Western Hemisphere? Well, it means the United States, in its sort of haphazard retreat from other parts of the world. Europe is probably the best example, but there are some question marks in terms of the Middle East and even the Asia-Pacific region. In this retreat, what does the US cling on to? It clings on to its hemisphere. And we're seeing sort of a reassertion of US power in the Western Hemisphere. I think a lot of analysts concur that it is a lot of stick and not a lot of carrot. So basically, it's a reassertion of power based on security and security cooperation, or even outright threats like the ones we're seeing in the build-up in the Caribbean right now, and not so much on economic cooperation or trade, where the Chinese are growing tremendously in Latin America. Most South American countries now have much greater trade relations with China than they do with the United States. So, it is a kind of a bit of a knee-jerk security reaction, reasserting power through the presence of the Southcom, the military, the Fourth Fleet, which is the fleet for the Western Hemisphere, and now this military build-up in the Caribbean. So we'll have to see what happens in the medium to long term, whether this is sustainable. But certainly, I think this is part and parcel of the new world order in which we exist, and the United States clinging on to its great power status and making itself felt in its hemisphere. One last thing I'd add to that is that the war on drugs is really, and which has been really declared by the Trump administration, is really being weaponized, not just in Venezuela, but throughout the hemisphere, in Mexico, in Colombia, and Ecuador. And it's the new, a harsh word is pretext, but I think it's a word we can use for the United States to sort of rekindle its policy of having military bases in various countries, to be militarily present, to have close security cooperation between the deep states of the United States and Latin American states. This is the new thing. The war on drugs is enabling this policy of reasserting its military might in its hemisphere.
So will these attacks then stop with Venezuela, or do you see them expanding to other countries? Because Trump has named other Latin American countries as involved in this drug trade and smuggling drugs into America. Do you think other countries could also be on his radar after Venezuela?
The administration has formally announced that they've considered at least military action or strikes in a number of countries, right? Including, they've mentioned Mexico, and they've mentioned Colombia, they've mentioned Venezuela. It's difficult to say. There's also a very assertive policy towards Ecuador of trying to reimpose a military base that had been closed there for a number of years. It's very difficult to say, but I think, yes, ultimately there is a policy of the Trump administration of looking tough on crime, of trying to look tough on narco traffickers and gangs and so on and so forth. They've done the easy bit right now, which is to bomb ships in the Caribbean, whether they actually have narco traffickers on board or not, and whether it's extrajudicial killings, which a lot of experts concur that it is a different issue. But I think we can see more of that, whether they actually dare to violate the sovereignty of states or even go after state forces, the military and security apparatus of different countries. That remains to be seen. I think Trump is starting to reconsider. There was an important vote last week in the US Senate, which the Democrats lost by very few votes, the War Powers resolution to try and prevent Trump from invading or militarily intervening in Venezuela. The Democrats lost this, but we know the night before the vote, Marco Rubio himself went to the Senate, met with the Republicans, and promised not to intervene, but not to vote for this resolution so as not to give a victory for the Democrats.
Right.
So at least there are promises now being made by the Trump administration to its own legislators, to its own Republican senators, that they won't do this. So maybe the US administration is starting to get cold feet, but very difficult to predict. A very volatile and dangerous situation with the largest military buildup in a generation in the Caribbean right now, looking very threatening for a number of countries, and first and foremost, Venezuela.
Right. Now, finally, let me just ask you about the Western conversation around what's happening. The United Kingdom has cut off intelligence sharing with the US in the Caribbean after those strikes in September. From other European capitals, we haven't heard a lot of criticism for what are essentially extrajudicial killings. Like I mentioned, 19 strikes without any evidence, without any trial, that have killed like 76 people so far at sea. Surely we should see more of America's allies and foes speak out against what is essentially open flouting of the international order.
I mean, I totally agree with you. I think it's a more systemic problem in Europe right now of towing the US line and not really raising its voice. It's clearly unlawful killings. It violates international law, including the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, maritime law, and so on and so forth. So there have been a few timid condemnations. We just saw the British announcement that they wouldn't be sharing intelligence. A couple of weeks ago, we saw a fairly firm condemnation by the French Foreign Ministry. But, yes, it doesn't really go much further than that. I'm not sure that it's been elevated at the diplomatic level or at the bilateral level, if you like, between the Europeans and the United States. They seem to be announcements that are not really being followed up by serious conversations, serious diplomatic conversations between the European states and the United States. The Americas are not a priority for the Europeans, and they've by and large, over the last few years, I would say, abandoned Latin America to its fate. There are some economic interests, of course, because the European Union is still the largest trading partner for Latin America. That's the Union as a whole. China is now the single largest trading partner as a single entity, as a country. But so there are economic interests. But in terms of security, which is what we're talking about here, and military hegemony, if you like, the Europeans are not meddling really with that. They're not intervening. They're not saying much. And yeah, they're towing the line ultimately.
Right. Well, let's hope that changes and more people come out and criticize what the Americans are doing, because this is the biggest military buildup we have seen in the Caribbean in decades. The largest warship on the planet is heading there, and things are not looking good for the region if you're watching it from the outside. We'll see how this military situation evolves. Thank you so much, Mr. Long, for speaking to us.
Thank you.
Firstpost.
Want the facts?
The latest developments?
News that gets straight to the point.
Well, we've got all three just for you. This is Firstpost Live, a brand new show, your window into what really matters.
Don't miss it.